She signed the marriage certificate with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. Not from cold, but from the kind of shame that settles into your bones and stays. Her father's debt, her body, her future, all exchanged across a banker's desk while the whole town watched and said nothing. But the man she was being handed to didn't look at her the way the others did. He looked at the banker, and the way his jaw set told her something was about to happen that none of them were ready for. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Claire's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The morning Claire Dawson was married off the air smelled like dust and something rotting underneath the floorboards of Harlan Graves's bank. She noticed that smell the moment she walked through the door. It had always been there, she supposed, hidden under the polish of mahogany furniture and the false dignity of a man who wore a gold watch chain to remind everyone that he had money and they did not. But today it was worse. Today it was suffocating. She kept her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on the floor, because looking at Harlan Graves made her stomach turn in ways she didn't have language for yet. Her mother sat in the corner chair weeping into a handkerchief that was already soaked through. She had been weeping since dawn. Claire had stopped asking her to calm down before they left the house because there was no point. Margaret Dawson was a woman who had always let her feelings flood the room, and today she had more reason than most to let them pour. Thomas Dawson had been dead for 63 days. 63 days since they found him at the bottom of the ravine, his horse standing nearby like it was waiting for someone to come collect both of them. 63 days since the sheriff came to the door with his hat in his hands and that particular look men get when they have to deliver news they'd rather not carry. And 58 days since Harlan Graves had appeared at their door with a folder of documents and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thomas Dawson, it turned out, had borrowed against everything. The house, the land. The small savings account, he'd told Margaret, was for the girls' futures. All of it had been quietly, methodically pledged against loans Claire hadn't known existed, until a man in a brown suit came to enumerate them while her mother went white as chalk. $4,230. That was the number Harlan Graves had set on her father's life, on her family's survival, on the question of whether her mother and her younger sister Nora would have a roof over their heads before winter came. Claire was 23 years old, not 19, as the rumors in town had quickly transformed her stripping years from her to make the story more palatable to people who wanted to feel sorry for her without feeling responsible. She was 23, she was a school teacher, and she had spent the past 58 days going over every possible solution in the careful, methodical way she'd once organized lesson plans. There were no solutions. She had checked. The schoolhouse salary wasn't enough. The savings were gone. The neighbors who'd offered sympathy at the funeral had not offered money, and she hadn't asked, because asking felt like surrendering something she could never recover. And so here she was, standing in Harlan Graves's bank in the dress her mother had altered to look as close to respectable as their remaining circumstances allowed, watching a man she had never spoken more than 10 words to sign a piece of paper that bound her name to his. She didn't know Ethan Boone. Nobody in Millhaven knew Ethan Boone very well, which was, she had come to understand exactly how he preferred it. He came down from the mountains twice a year, once in late spring, once before the first hard frost to sell horses, buy supplies and leave before anyone had the chance to learn his name. He paid in cash. He didn't drink at the saloon. He didn't sit at the bar and complain about the government or the weather or his neighbors. He loaded his wagon, nodded at whoever happened to make eye contact, and rode back up into the Rockies before sunset. He was known in the vague way that solitary men tend to be known in small towns as someone you didn't trouble unnecessarily. Claire had seen him once 3 years before her father died, when he'd brought a string of mountain horses through town, and she'd watched from the schoolhouse window as he'd handled a particularly skittish gray stallion with a patience so absolute it was almost strange to witness. He hadn't forced the horse. He hadn't yanked the lead rope or raised his voice. He'd simply stood still, waiting until the animal decided on its own that the man wasn't a threat. She'd thought watching that that she'd never seen a person that disciplined in her life. She hadn't thought about him again until Harlan Graves sat across from her 2 weeks ago and told her there was an arrangement being considered. "Mr. Boone has expressed an interest," Graves had said, with the particular smoothness of a man who knows he has you cornered. "He's in need of a household manager, someone capable, and given your family's circumstances, it seems like a mutually beneficial solution." "You mean a wife?" Claire had said flatly. Graves had smiled. "A legal arrangement, one that would clear your father's debt entirely and provide security for your mother and sister." "And if I decline?" The smile didn't waver. "Then the bank proceeds with foreclosure. The property goes to auction within 30 days. I believe there are interested buyers already." She'd looked at her mother, who had been sitting in that same corner chair, and she'd seen the way Margaret's hands were gripping the armrests, like they were the edge of something she'd fall off if she let go. She'd said yes, not because she wanted to, not because she thought it was right, but because she had run out of other options, and the only thing worse than this choice was the one she'd be making for her mother and Nora if she refused. Now she stood in the bank and the paper was signed, and Harlan Graves was beaming with the self-satisfaction of a man who had closed a deal he'd engineered from the beginning. He was talking something about the transfer of the debt certificate, something about the official record with the county, but Claire had stopped hearing him. She was watching Ethan Boone. He stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim in a motion that seemed almost unconscious. He was taller than she'd remembered, broader through the shoulders. He wore a plain canvas shirt, dark trousers, boots that had seen real use. There was nothing decorative about him. No watch chain, no studied dignity. He looked like a man who lived by what he did with his hands and had no interest in looking like anything else. His face was weathered in the way that belonged to men who spent their lives outdoors, with lines at the corners of his eyes and along his jaw that put his age somewhere in his mid-30s. He wasn't handsome in any way the girls in town would have called handsome. He was simply there, solid, real in a way that Harlan Graves, with all his polished furniture, had never managed to be. He hadn't looked at her once since they'd entered the bank. That bothered her. She couldn't have said why. She supposed she'd expected something, assessment or calculation or the particular look men gave women they were acquiring. But Ethan Boone kept his eyes on the desk or the window or the middle distance beyond Harlan Graves's right shoulder, and he stood with the stillness of a man who had learned a very long time ago not to show what he was thinking. "Well," Graves said, finally gathering the papers with a flourish, "I believe that settles the matter. Congratulations to you both." He extended his hand to Boone. Ethan looked at it for a moment, just a moment long enough to be noticed, and then shook it once briefly and stepped back. He looked at Claire then. For the first time since she'd come through the door, his eyes were gray, or maybe dark green. In the light from the bank windows, it was difficult to say. What she could say was that there was nothing predatory in them, nothing triumphant. He looked at her with an expression that was so entirely neutral it might have been insulting if she hadn't been so exhausted by every man in this room who had looked at her with something worse. "Ma'am," he said, just that, one word. "Mr. Boone," she said back. And that was the whole of their introduction. Her mother rushed forward, then clutching Claire's arm, whispering things that were meant to be comforting and weren't. "Be good, be patient, write as soon as you can, don't make him angry." And Claire let her mother hold her because Margaret needed that more than Claire needed the practical advice she was already not going to follow. Nora, who was 16 and had been standing near the door this whole time, came and put her arms around Claire's waist without saying anything. She was better at silence than their mother. Claire held her for a long moment, with her chin resting on her sister's hair. "Don't let her skip her arithmetic," Claire said. Nora laughed, wet and broken. "You're the only one who cares about arithmetic." "I know, that's why I'm saying it." She pulled back. She picked up the small bag she'd packed everything she'd decided to take, which wasn't much, which was the only decision in this entire situation she'd been allowed to make. She walked across the bank floor to where Ethan Boone was waiting near the door, hat back on his head, patient in the way she was beginning to suspect was his default setting. She did not look at Harlan Graves on her way out. He called after them. Safe travels, Mr. Boone. Miss Dawson, Mrs. Boone. Ethan pushed the door open and held it without comment. She walked through it into the June heat and didn't look back. The wagon was loaded with supplies. Serious supplies, flour, salt, dried goods, tools, rope, ammunition. Not the wagon of a man making a social trip. This was the wagon of a man who lived far enough from civilization that every journey down from the mountains was a calculated logistics operation, and he wasn't going to waste the run. He went to the horse on the right side first and checked something about the rigging, running his hand along the animal's flank in that same patient way she'd noticed 3 years ago from the schoolhouse window. The horse leaned into his hand slightly. Claire stood on the boardwalk and watched him. She didn't know what she was supposed to do. Wait to be helped up. Climb up herself. She chose climbing up herself partly because she was capable of it, and partly because she didn't want to start this arrangement by waiting to be managed. She got herself up onto the bench, settled her bag between her feet, and folded her hands in her lap. He came around, checked the other horse, then climbed up beside her with the economical movement of a man who'd done this 10,000 times and had no thoughts about it. He gathered the reins. He didn't say anything. They sat there for a moment. The whole of Millhaven's main street spread out in front of them in the thick summer heat, and Claire was distinctly aware that people were watching. From the general store, from the barber shop, from the window of the dress shop where old Frances Tillman had her nose practically pressed to the glass. She kept her spine straight. "Ready?" he asked. "Just that." "Yes," she said. He clicked to the horses, and they moved. She watched the town fall away behind them as they turned north toward the mountain road, and she thought about what her mother had said that morning when they were still at home and the day hadn't fully arrived yet. "You'll be all right. You're strong. You've always been strong." And she had nodded and not said what she was actually thinking, which was that strength was not the issue. The issue was that she hadn't been given a choice, and all the strength in the world couldn't change what that did to a person. She was not all right. She might not be all right for a very long time. But she was not going to cry. Not here. Not next to this silent stranger who had, for reasons she didn't understand, agreed to pay a dead man's debts in exchange for a woman he'd never spoken to. She had questions, about 30 of them. She hadn't decided yet whether to ask any. They rode in silence for the better part of an hour. The road climbed gradually, leaving the valley floor and the dry, baked flatness of the town behind. The air changed as they went higher, cooler, heavier with pine, and the smell of water somewhere close. The summer heat that had been sitting on her like a hand pressing down began to lighten slightly. He drove the way he seemed to do most things, without waste, without showmanship. He watched the road and the horses and occasionally the tree line, and he didn't appear to feel the need to fill silence with talk. She found unexpectedly that she didn't either. It was her that broke it eventually, not because the silence bothered her, but because the questions had been building behind her teeth, and she was not a woman who did well with sustained uncertainty. "How far is it?" she asked. "To the cabin." She paused. "Your property. How far?" 4 hours from town, he said. "Closer to 5 today, with the extra load." She looked at the wagon bed. "How often do you come down?" "Twice a year." "And in between?" "In between, I'm up there." She considered that. "That's very isolated." "Yes." "Does it bother you?" He was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone avoiding the question, but in the way of someone who didn't answer carelessly. "No," he said. "It suits me." She looked at the road ahead. "It may not suit me." "I know." That surprised her enough that she turned to look at him. He was watching the horses. "You know," she said slowly, "and you arranged this anyway." "I arranged this because Harlan Graves was going to take your families home and put your mother and sister out before first snow," he said. The words were flat and even like he was reading them off a list. That seemed like something that shouldn't happen. She stared at him. "You don't know my family." "I know Harlan Graves." She turned back to the road. Something shifted in her chest very slightly. in a way she didn't examine too closely, because she wasn't ready to feel grateful yet. Grateful felt like conceding something she needed to hold on to for a little while longer. "What do you expect from me?" she asked. "In this arrangement." "Expect?" he repeated like he was tasting the word. "I expect nothing. I have a working property. It requires work. If you're willing to learn, I'll teach you what needs doing. If there are things you're not willing to do, I'd rather you say so directly than do them badly out of obligation." "That's very practical?" "Yes. Most men would have different expectations," she said carefully. He didn't answer right away. The road curved around a rock outcropping, and he guided the horses through it with small, precise adjustments of the reins. "I'm not most men," he said finally. She had no response to that. It wasn't arrogance. It was simply a statement of position delivered with the same flatness he seemed to apply to everything. She filed it away somewhere and kept her eyes on the mountains ahead. The cabin was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture in her mind on the long ride up small, dark, a single room that smelled like a man who'd lived alone for years. She'd prepared herself for it the way she prepared herself for most things now, by setting her expectations low enough that the reality could only be better. It was better, substantially. The structure was solid timber, 2 full stories with a covered porch that ran along the front, and a second one along the back that looked out over a meadow, dropping away toward a creek she could hear but not yet see. Outbuildings to the side, a large barn, a storage shed, a smaller structure she couldn't immediately identify. A corral with 4 horses watching their approach with the particular alertness of animals that knew this wagon. It looked like a place someone had built with intention, with the idea of staying. He pulled the wagon around to the barn and set the brake, then climbed down and began unhitching the team with the focused efficiency of a man moving through a familiar routine. She climbed down herself again without waiting and stood there for a moment in the summer evening light. The air up here was different, thinner, cooler, carrying the sound of wind through the pines on the ridge above. After the oppressive heat of the valley, it felt like something loosening. "Water's from the creek," he said, without looking up from the harness. "Quarter mile that way. I've got a system bringing it to the kitchen cistern. Should be full. I filled it before I came down." "I see. Kitchen's through the back door. Bedroom's upstairs first door. There's a second room up there I use for storage." He paused. "It'll take a day or 2 to clear enough space for another bed." "I can help clear it," she said. "All right." He finished with the horses and led them toward the barn. She picked up her bag and walked toward the cabin. The kitchen was clean in the spare functional way of a person who kept things orderly, not out of any particular concern for appearances, but because disorder created problems, and problems wasted time. Shelves with organized stores. A cast iron stove that had been properly maintained. A table. 2 chairs, a window that faced west. She set her bag down on the table and stood in the middle of the kitchen and let herself breathe. This was her life now. She had thought somewhere on the long ride up that the moment she arrived, she would feel something decisive, terror, or despair, or some final crystallization of the grief she'd been pushing down since her father died. But what she felt standing in Ethan Boone's kitchen in the last light of a June evening was something she didn't immediately have a word for. It might have been simply that she had stopped moving. And stopping after 63 days of constant motion through grief and obligation and impossible choices felt like something her body didn't quite know what to do with. She found the water cistern and washed her hands and face. She found the shelf with the coffee tin. She built a fire in the stove with wood from the stack beside it. She was making coffee when he came in through the back door, having settled the horses. He stopped just inside the door, looking at what she was doing. "You don't have to," he started. "I'm making coffee," she said. "I need coffee. You can have some if you want it." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. He sat at the table. She poured 2 cups. The coffee was strong, the way hers always was, and she watched his face for any reaction to it, but didn't get one, and she sat across from him, and they drank in silence while the last of the day fell off the mountains outside. It was the strangest evening of her life. It was also somehow the most quiet she had felt since the sheriff had come to the door with his hat in his hands. After a while, he set his cup down and said, "You should get some rest. Day starts early up here." "How early?" 5:30 in summer." She nodded. "I'll be up." He looked at her then, that same direct gray-green look she'd gotten in the bank. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. "I'm not keeping score." It was such a precisely accurate thing to say, as if he'd identified exactly the mode she'd slipped into, without knowing that she didn't have an immediate answer for it. "Old habit," she said finally. "All right." He stood, picked up his cup, rinsed it at the cistern. "There are extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed," he said. "Gets cold up here at night, even in summer." "Thank you." He picked up a lantern from the shelf, lit it, and handed it to her. "Good night, Miss Dawson." She had been about to say the same, but the name stopped her. "Mrs. Boone," she said. "Is that what I am now?" He looked at her steadily. "If you prefer it. I don't know what I prefer yet." "Then take some time to figure it out," he said. "No one up here is going to call you either one." She took the lantern and climbed the stairs. The bedroom was simple, clean. A bed built from timber, a chest of drawers, the blanket chest he'd mentioned. A single window looking out toward the dark shape of the ridgeline. She set the lantern on the chest of drawers and sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She sat there for a long time, in the particular silence of the mountains, which was not the absence of sound, but a different kind of sound. Wind, distant water, something calling from the ridge, and she thought about her mother and Nora in the house that was now safe because of a man she didn't know. She thought about her father and the debts and all the ways things could have gone differently if he'd only told them the truth. She thought about Harlan Graves's expression when she'd walked out of his bank without looking back, and then she thought about what Ethan Boone had said on the road. "I know Harlan Graves." That seemed like something that shouldn't happen. Not a grand speech, not a declaration, just a flat factual accounting of why he'd done what he'd done. Because he'd seen an injustice and he'd had the means to stop it, and stopping it had seemed like the straightforward thing to do. She pulled the blanket from the chest and lay down on top of the covers without undressing, and she listened to the mountains settling into night around her. She heard him downstairs for a little while. The quiet sounds of a man finishing up the last tasks of his day. Something set down, a door checked, a latch engaged. Then nothing. She thought, "I have no idea what I'm doing here." And then, because she was so tired, she slept. She was up before 5. She dressed in the dark, relying on the pale early light coming through the window, then sat on the edge of the bed and laced her boots and listened to the cabin. No sound from below yet. She went downstairs and built the fire in the stove and put water on for coffee, then stood at the kitchen window while the water heated and watched the light come over the ridge in the slow, unhurried way it had up here, like the mountain itself decided when the day was allowed to begin. He came downstairs about 20 minutes later, fully dressed, moving through the kitchen with the quiet sureness of a man operating in his own environment. He stopped when he saw the coffee was already made. He looked at her. She looked back. "I said I'd be up," she told him. He poured a cup and sat at the table. "You'll want to know the morning routine," he said. "Yes." He told her, practically, clearly. What needed doing in what order, what she could learn immediately, and what would take time, where things were, and why they were there. He spoke the way he seemed to do everything, without embellishment, without condescension, without making her feel that asking questions would be a burden. She asked questions. He answered them. When they finished the coffee, he stood up and said, "The horses first." And she followed him out into the sharp morning air, and the beginning of a day she hadn't chosen and wasn't ready for, and was going to manage anyway, because that was the only thing she knew how to do. She was in the corral watching him work with one of the mares when she heard the sound. A shout from somewhere below the property, somewhere down the road that wound back toward the valley. Sharp. Followed by another. Ethan had heard it too. He stilled in the same way he'd been still in the bank, completely and instantly, and looked down the road with that focused, unhurried attention. "What is that?" she said. He didn't answer right away. He stayed where he was for a long moment listening. "Don't know," he said finally, but something had shifted in his posture, some very slight, very controlled adjustment of the way he held himself that told her he suspected something. She watched his face. "Is there something you want to tell me, Mr. Boone?" He looked at her. "Someone's been watching the road," he said quietly, "for the last 3 days. I noticed it when I came down for you." A pause. "I don't know who they are yet." She absorbed this. "And you didn't think to mention it." "I didn't want to frighten you before you'd had time to settle." "I would have preferred the information," she said evenly. He looked at her for a long moment. Something that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of a smile moved in the corner of his mouth and then didn't become one. "Noted," he said. She turned back toward the sound which had faded into the ordinary morning noise of the mountain. "What do? We carry on," he said, "and we pay attention." He went back to the mare. She watched the road for another moment, then turned and followed him. The shouting below the property stopped before noon. Ethan didn't go down to investigate. He went about the morning work the same way he'd gone about everything else since Claire had arrived, methodically, without announcement, without explaining every decision, as though he owed her a running commentary. She noticed that, and filed it away. He wasn't secretive. He simply didn't narrate. There was a difference, and she was still learning to locate it. She spent the first half of that morning failing at splitting wood. He'd shown her once. One clean demonstration, the angle, the weight shift, the follow-through, and then he'd handed her the axe and stepped back and gone to mend a stretch of corral fencing 20 feet away. He hadn't hovered. He hadn't offered corrections every time she missed. He worked his fence and let her work her wood and only looked up when the sound pattern changed in a way that suggested she might be about to hurt herself. She'd looked up and caught him watching once. He'd looked back down at his fence. "I'm not doing it right," she called over to him. "You're doing it," he said. "That's the right part for now." She stared at the half-split log in front of her. "That's very philosophical for 6 in the morning." "It's 7:30. She drove the axe down again. This time it caught clean, and the log came apart with a crack that was deeply satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. She looked at the 2 pieces. "There," she said to no one in particular. "Good," he said to no one in particular, either, still looking at his fence. By the time the sun was properly overhead, she had split enough wood to justify the effort. Her shoulders were burning in ways she would feel for days. And she had arrived at the unpleasant conclusion that she was significantly less physically capable than she'd assumed herself to be. She taught children. She carried books and chalk, and the occasional upset 6-year-old. She was not accustomed to the specific demands of survival labor, and her body was registering its objections in full. She didn't say any of this. She stacked the wood and went inside to start the midday meal, because that was the next thing on the list he'd given her, and she was working the list. He came in when the food was ready without being called, which meant he'd tracked the time and what she was likely doing from wherever he was, which meant he was paying attention in a way he made look like he wasn't. She put a plate on the table. He sat and ate. She sat across from him and ate. "The people on the road?" she said without preamble. He looked up. "What do they want?" she asked. "Best guess." He chewed, swallowed, set his fork down. "There's been talk in town about a gold vein on this property," he said. She kept her face even. "Is there one?" "There's some surface mineral. Not what the talk makes it out to be." His jaw shifted. "But once talk starts, it doesn't need the truth to keep going." "And Harlan Graves?" she asked. "Is he connected to whoever's watching the road?" The pause that followed was very brief. Most people wouldn't have caught it. "I think that's likely," he said. She picked her fork back up. "You knew this when you came down to town?" "Yes." "And you still came?" "Yes." She let that sit for a moment. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, one of the horses moved in the corral. "So you didn't just come down for supplies," she said. "I came down for supplies," he said. and to clear the debt before Graves found another way to use it. She looked at him. You came down to take away. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She put her fork down on the plate and leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, because there was something happening in her chest that she needed a second to manage. It wasn't gratitude exactly. Or it was, but it was the kind of gratitude that had anger underneath it, not at him, but at the entire architecture of circumstances that had made any of this necessary. I want to know what I'm actually in the middle of, she said. Not the version you've decided is appropriate to tell me. The full version. He studied her. You sure, Mr. Boone? She looked at him directly. My father kept things from us because he thought protecting us from information was the same as protecting us. He was wrong. I am not my mother. I do not need to be managed. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, just slightly in the way that a door shifts on its hinges when someone puts a hand against it from the other side. Graves has been trying to acquire this land for 2 years, he said. He's made 3 separate offers. I declined all of them. A pause. After the third one, some of his hired men came up here and told me to reconsider. And did you? No. What happened to them? They left, he said. Eventually. She looked at him for a long moment, deciding not to ask exactly what that meant. So now he's using the debt to get a foothold. If he couldn't buy the land or frighten you off it, he could at least... She stopped. He could at least put someone in my house who might report back on the property. Ethan said flatly. Where the water is, how the approaches sit, what the layout of the outbuildings is. The words landed like stones in still water. He thought I'd spy for him, she said. He thought you'd have no reason not to. She was very still for a moment. The anger that moved through her was not hot and immediate, the way anger usually was. It was cold, and it moved slow, and that was the kind that lasted. He does not know me, she said. No. Ethan agreed. He doesn't. She picked her fork back up and finished her food in silence. Not the silence of someone shutting down. The silence of someone making decisions. When she was done, she said, Tell me what I need to know about this property. Everything. If someone asks me something, I want to have a real answer that gives nothing away, not a lie that falls apart in the first question. He looked at her for a moment, in that considering way of his. All right, he said. He talked through the afternoon, while they worked about the land, the water sources, the outbuildings. What was real and what wasn't about the mineral talk. He spoke plainly, and didn't simplify things, and she kept up without asking him to slow down, and she noticed that each time she asked a sharp question, he answered it without changing his tone, like he'd expected her to have sharp questions. Like that was fine with him. By late afternoon, she knew more about Ethan Boone's land than Harlan Graves likely knew after 2 years of trying to acquire it. She also knew, without either of them having said it explicitly, that they had moved from an arrangement into something more like an alliance. The first week passed in the way of things that are difficult and necessary and don't care about your feelings regarding either quality. She got up before 5 every morning because she'd said she would. Her body staged sustained protests for the first 4 days, shoulders back, hands. She didn't mention it. She worked through it the way she'd worked through most difficult things, which was to simply keep moving until the difficult thing became the ordinary thing. He noticed. She knew he noticed because he adjusted what he assigned her without making a production of it, more of the indoor tasks. On the days her hands were worst, less of the heavy lifting. When her back was at its worst, without ever once suggesting that she wasn't capable or that he was accommodating her. He simply arranged the work differently and said nothing about why. She didn't thank him for it. She thought he'd find that embarrassing. She just did the adjusted work and kept pace. On the 4th night, sitting at the table after supper with the lamp between them, she said, "Tell me about the horse breeding." He looked up from the harness piece he was mending. "The horses," she said. "You sell them twice a year. How do you know which buyers to trust?" Something in his face shifted just slightly. Just enough. Like the question had landed in a place he hadn't expected. "You watch them with the animals," he said. A man who's cruel to a horse before he's bought it will be worse after. And if they hide it, most things people try to hide they show anyway. He went back to the harness. You just have to know what to look for. She was quiet for a moment. What do you look for? He considered this with the seriousness he applied to most things. Whether they listen, he said, to the animal. Whether they change anything about the way they're moving based on what the horse is telling them. Men who've already decided what they think don't hear anything that contradicts it. She looked at him across the lamp. That's not just about horses, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. She turned back to the list of inventory she'd been cross-referencing against the stores in the kitchen. After a moment, she heard him make a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood. What? She said. Nothing. He kept working. You're fast. I was a school teacher. Fast is... She stopped. The was caught in her throat in a way she hadn't anticipated. She looked at the list. Fast is necessary, she finished. He didn't comment on the pause. She was grateful for that. You could teach up here, he said after a moment. There are families on the lower ridge. 3-4 children between them who've been without a teacher since the Millhaven school was too far to walk. She looked up. I'm not proposing it, he said. I'm just saying it exists. She thought about a classroom on a mountain, about children with no other options, about the things she'd been good at that had been cut off at the same moment everything else had been cut away. Maybe, she said. Not a promise, just an opening. He nodded and went back to the harness. She went back to the inventory. The lamp burned between them, and neither of them needed to say that this ordinary quiet working evening was its own kind of strange and its own kind of decent. On the 5th day, one of them came up to the property. She heard the horse before she saw it. A single rider coming up the road at an easy pace that was designed to look casual and wasn't. She was at the water cistern, filling the kitchen bucket, and she straightened up and watched the rider come through the gate without stopping. He was young. 20, maybe 22. He had the look of a man who was new to taking orders and was overcompensating for his own nervousness with a studied ease that didn't reach his eyes. Morning, he said, pulling up near the porch steps. Boone around. He's on the property, she said. She set the bucket down. Can I help you? The young man looked her over in the way men did when they were reassessing a situation they'd thought was simpler. Didn't know Boone had taken a wife, he said. Is there something I can tell him you need? She said. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. She'd spent years managing a schoolroom full of children who tested limits. She knew exactly how to be pleasant in a way that moved people where she wanted them without their noticing. Just passing through, he said. Thought I'd pay my respects. That's very kind. I'll let him know you stopped by. She smiled. I didn't catch your name. He hadn't given it. She'd known he wouldn't. But asking made him uncomfortable in a way she needed him to be. Dawson, he said, clearly invented on the spot. Mr. Dawson, she said, safe travels. He looked at her for another moment, then swung his horse and rode back the way he'd come. She picked up the bucket and went back inside. Ethan was in the barn when she found him. She told him what had happened, the description of the rider, the invented name, the way he'd looked at the property layout before he'd looked at her, and she told it in sequence without editorializing because the facts were sufficient. He listened with his hands still on the bridle he'd been working on. You got a good look at him? He asked when she finished. Young, dark hat, gray horse with a white left foreleg, a scar above his right eyebrow, maybe 2 inches horizontal. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You remembered all that? I told you, I'm a school teacher. She looked at him. Was a school teacher. You still are, he said. Matter of fact, like it was obvious. Something about the simplicity of it, the complete absence of past tense, hit her in a place she hadn't been protecting. She turned away and looked at the barn wall and did a very careful job of not showing what that had done. They're mapping the property, she said when she was sure her voice was steady. Yes. So they'll be back. Yes. Then we should assume they're counting who's here, what the routine is when the property is undefended. She turned back. Which means be predictable. He looked at her. That look that she was beginning to understand was his version of being impressed, since he didn't have a louder version. No, he agreed. We shouldn't. The second week started with rain. Not the dramatic cleansing kind. The kind that moved in low and stayed a steady, cold, relentless presence that found every gap in determination and worked at it. She was not prepared for a Rocky Mountain summer storm. She had not understood, in the abstract way she'd understood it from the valley, what this kind of weather meant for people who lived by what they could do with their hands. Everything took longer. Everything was harder. Every task carried the additional weight of cold, wet clothing and ground that had gone from cooperative to actively hostile. She slipped on the third morning carrying feed from the storage shed to the barn. It wasn't a bad fall. She caught herself on the fence post and came away with a scraped palm and a bruised knee and a mouthful of cold mud. She got up. She checked the bucket she'd been carrying mostly intact, and she finished carrying it to the barn because the horses still needed feeding regardless of whether she'd just eaten the earth. She was hanging her wet jacket by the stove when she heard him come in behind her. "You're bleeding," he said. "I know." She'd been pressing her palm against her jacket. He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard him go to the shelf where the medical kit was. She'd cataloged it on day 2, because cataloging things was how she learned spaces, and she heard him open it. "Here," he said. She turned. He was holding out a square of clean cloth. She took it and pressed it to her palm, and he stood there looking at the cut with the focused, practical concern of someone who needed to assess whether this was a problem or just an inconvenience. "Let me see," he said. She uncovered it. He looked at it. "Not deep," he said. "Needs cleaning." She let him clean it. She stood at the kitchen table with her hand palm up while he worked with the antiseptic solution and the bandaging with the same care he used for his horses, competent, quiet, not making it larger than it was. His hands were rough but steady, and he moved efficiently without rushing. "I should have worn better boots," she said. "Better boots would help," he agreed. "Do you have spare boots somewhere?" He looked up. "Not women's boots," she said. "I'm not expecting that, but something with more grip than what I have, even if it's just for the wet season." He considered this. "I have a pair that belong to my—" He stopped. A very brief stoppage, the kind that has history in it. "There's a pair in the storage room, smaller than what I wear. You could try them." She didn't ask who they'd belong to. The pause had told her what she needed to know, which was that the answer had weight he hadn't decided to carry in front of her yet. "Thank you," she said. He finished the bandaging and stepped back. She looked at his work, clean and practical and sufficient. "You've done that before," she said. "Not on horses." "I was an Army Scout," he said. "Before this." She looked at him. He was already putting the medical kit back on the shelf. "Where?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "A lot of places," he said. "None of them worth talking about." She accepted that. Not because she wasn't curious, but because she understood that some information was a gift people gave when they were ready and not before. She flexed her bandaged hand carefully. "What time does the rain usually break?" "By evening if we're lucky." "Then we can finish the fence section this evening," she said. He looked at her, that look again. "You don't have to," he started. "I know," she said. "I want to finish it." A pause. The fence. The rain broke at 4, and they went out and finished the fence. The ground was still soft, and the air had that particular raw quality that settles in after sustained cold rain. They worked side by side, driving posts running wire, Claire learning by watching and then by doing while he worked ahead of her. He didn't comment on her technique unless she asked. She started asking more. Like this. She'd get the position. He'd look, nod or adjust with his hand on the post to show her the difference. She'd feel the difference. File it. By the time they finished, the light had gone gold over the ridge in the way that happened up here when the weather cleared sudden and dramatic and achingly clear, like the mountain was apologizing for the rain by showing you what it looked like afterward. She stood with her hands on the top wire and looked out over the meadow and the clean evening sky and breathed. "My father used to say the debt wasn't as bad as he knew it was," she said without planning to. The words just surfaced. Ethan was rolling the remaining wire a few feet away. He didn't stop what he was doing. "He must have been scared," he said. She kept looking at the sky. "I think he was ashamed," she said. "I think he was ashamed, and he thought if he didn't say it out loud, it would somehow get better before we had to know." "Did he love your family?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Very much. That's why he couldn't face telling us. He couldn't stand being the one who'd let us down." "So he made it worse," Ethan said. "He made it worse." She looked down at the wire under her hands. Silence doesn't protect people. It just keeps them from preparing. The roll of wire settled in Ethan's hands, and he didn't answer immediately. When she looked at him, his face was turned slightly away toward the ridge. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't." Something in his voice had changed. Not by much. Enough. She didn't push. She straightened up and started gathering the tools. Then the twist came, and it came in a way she hadn't seen arriving. 3 weeks in. A morning so clean and clear it felt like an argument that things could be good. She was in the barn checking on the youngest mare. Ethan had told her the animal had been showing some inflammation in her right foreleg, and to watch it when she heard voices below the property. Not one voice, several. And below that, the distinct sound of more than one horse moving on the road. She went to the barn door. 4 riders. Coming up the road openly this time. No pretense of casual passage. The young man from the week before, the one who'd called himself Dawson, was among them. The man riding at the front was older, heavier. He wore the kind of hat that was meant to communicate authority, and he carried himself the way men did when they'd decided they had the right to go where they went. She'd never seen him before, but she recognized the type with a certainty that came from watching Harlan Graves operate for the past several weeks. She went to find Ethan. He was already coming out of the storage shed, having heard the horses. He looked at the 4 riders coming up the road, and his face did the thing it did, that complete managed stillness that she'd stopped mistaking for absence of reaction. "Ethan." She kept her voice low. "The older one in front. Who is he?" He looked at her. "His name is Roy Callum," he said quietly. "He rode with Graves's operation out of Denver for the last 5 years." A pause. "He was also in my unit during the war." She absorbed this, the briefness of it, the weight underneath it. "He's the one who betrayed you," she said. It wasn't a question because his face had already answered it. "Yes," he said. Callum and his men pulled up 20 feet from the porch. He looked at Ethan the way that men who were once close and are no longer looked at each other, with a specific kind of familiarity that had gone rotten. "Boone," he said. "Callum," Ethan said. The morning sat between them like a held breath. "Nice place you've got." Callum said, his eyes moving over the property in exactly the systematic way she'd described from the young man's visit. "Didn't know you'd domesticated yourself." His eyes moved to Claire. "Ma'am." She said nothing. "Mr. Callum," Ethan said. His voice was completely level. "You're on my land." "I know it," Callum said pleasantly. "Thought we'd have a conversation, neighborly." "We're not neighbors." "No?" Callum smiled. "We're not." He shifted in his saddle. "I'm going to be straight with you, Boone, because that's the kind of men we are." "You've never been that kind of man," Ethan said quietly. "But go ahead." Callum's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "Graves wants this land settled up. He's willing to be fair about the price. I've had 3 offers from Harlan Graves. They weren't fair. 4th offer's better." Callum reached into his coat, and Claire's whole body went rigid, but he came out with a folded paper. not a weapon. Look at the number. Ethan didn't move toward it. Callum let the paper hang in the air between them. When it became clear Ethan wasn't taking it, he folded it and put it back in his coat. "You're a man," he said. "I'm a man who knows what his land is worth," Ethan said. "And I know what Graves wants it for, and neither of those things is going to change with a fourth offer." Callum looked at Claire again. Longer this time. "Your wife's settling in all right." The deliberateness of the question was not subtle. It was meant to suggest that they knew things, that people had been talking, that Callum's network of information reached further than the property line. "She's none of your business," Ethan said. "Everything up here is going to be our business eventually," Callum said, still pleasant. "That's the point I'm here to make." "You've made it," Ethan said. "Now get off my land." A pause. Long enough to assert that he was leaving because he chose to, not because he'd been told to. "We'll be seeing each other," Callum said. "Probably," Ethan agreed. Callum swung his horse. The three men with him followed. They rode back down the road, the way they'd come unhurried, and the sound of the horses faded into the ordinary sounds of the mountain morning. Claire waited until she was certain they were out of range. "He knows the layout," she said. "The young ones scouted it last week." "Yes." "So they know where the water is, where the barn is, how many approaches there are." She looked at him. "They're going to come back at night." "Probably. Then we need to change what they think they know," she said. Her mind was already moving. "Move the horses before dark. If they think the barn is worth hitting first, give them an empty barn. Keep the animals at the upper shelter." He looked at her. "And we need a way to know when someone's on the lower road before they get to the property," she continued. "Is there anyone on the lower ridge you trust?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a man. Tom Haskell. He has a place about 2 miles down. He's had his own troubles with Graves's men." "Then we should talk to him," she said. He was still looking at her in that particular way. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're—" He stopped, started again. "You think fast." "I told you," she said. "That's necessary." She turned toward the barn to start moving the horses. After a moment, she heard him fall in step behind her. But she had missed one thing. She didn't know it yet. Neither did he. The youngest rider, the one who'd called himself Dawson, had stayed back when the others rode out, had pulled off the road and waited in the tree line. And he had spent 20 very careful minutes watching from cover while they stood in the yard and talked close enough to see what they looked like when they thought they were alone. And what he'd seen was enough to take back to Callum. Not the property layout, not the water source. Something more useful than either. He'd seen the way she watched Ethan's face, and the way Ethan's hand had moved brief and unconscious to the small of her back when he fell in step behind her. He'd seen that they weren't strangers anymore. And Callum, who knew Ethan Boone better than almost anyone living, knew exactly what that meant, knew exactly where the pressure point was. The young rider turned his horse quietly back into the trees and headed down the mountain. Tom Haskell was a man who'd been through enough that he'd stopped being surprised by most things. He was 61. Wiry, with hands that told the story of 40 years of hard living in the mountains better than his face did. He'd lost his wife to fever 8 years back, raised 2 sons alone, and when Graves's men had come to his property 18 months ago with an offer he'd declined, they'd burned his south fence line and killed 2 of his cattle and ridden off laughing. He'd rebuilt the fence. He'd replaced the cattle when he could afford to. And he'd been waiting with the patient fury of a man who knows his moment will come for something to change the balance. Ethan had known Tom Haskell for 6 years. Had helped him drag timber for the rebuild after the fence fire. Had sold him a horse at half price the following spring without being asked and without making anything of it. They rode down to Haskell's place the morning after Callum's visit Claire on the gray mare she'd been learning Ethan on the big roan he favored, and Tom met them in the yard with the measuring look of a man who'd learned to assess people quickly. He looked at Claire for a long moment. "She the schoolteacher," he said to Ethan. "I'm standing right here," Claire said. Tom looked at her. Something in his face shifted. "Yes, you are," he said. "Come inside." His kitchen was smaller than Ethan's warmer, with the particular lived-in quality of a space that a man occupied alone and had long since stopped trying to make presentable. A rifle leaned against the wall by the door. A Bible sat on the table beside a tin cup. Tom poured coffee without asking and set it in front of them. "Callum came to your place," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yesterday," Ethan said. "He was at Denny Frost's place 3 days ago. Same approach. Neighborly visit with a price in his pocket." Tom wrapped his hands around his cup. "Denny didn't take it either." "How many of them?" "Callum runs with 5. The young one does the scouting, the others do the muscle." He looked at his coffee. "They burned Denny's storage shed last week, blamed it on a lantern accident." Claire felt the information land in her chest. "They're escalating," she said. Tom glanced at her. "If offers won't work, they move to damage," she continued. "Small enough that you can't prove it, large enough that you feel it." She paused. "They'll do it again." "That's been my thinking," Tom said. "Then we need a way to see them coming," Ethan said, "before they reach any of our properties." Tom was quiet for a moment. "My youngest boy, Cale, he's 16. Good rider. He knows this mountain better than most men twice his age." He looked at Ethan. "He's been wanting to do something useful about this for a year. I've been keeping him back." "He'd be watching a road," Ethan said, "not confronting anyone." "I know what he'd be doing." Tom's voice had an edge of quiet authority. "I'm saying I'll let him." They worked out the arrangement around that table in 30 minutes, a signal system, using positions on the ridge that anyone watching from below wouldn't recognize as anything but a man going about his day. Simple. Practical. Haskell's contribution was knowledge of the terrain. Ethan's was the 2 extra horses that would let Cale move fast if he needed to. Claire's contribution was the detail that neither of them had thought to include. "We need a reason for someone to be on that ridge that doesn't look like watching," she said. Both men looked at her. "A man sitting on a ridge does nothing but watch," she said, "which means if Callum's men are paying attention, they'll notice him in 2 days. But a boy checking trap lines—" She stopped. "Let them follow the logic." Tom's expression moved. "He runs trap lines on the East Ridge already," he said. "Has for 2 years. Then he keeps running them," she said, "on the same schedule he always has. And if he happens to be able to see the lower road from that ridge, and if he happens to come up to report on the trap lines to Mr. Boone every evening—" "They won't see anything unusual," Tom finished. He looked at Ethan. "She's quick." "She's a school teacher," Ethan said. "Was," Claire said without thinking. "Is," Ethan said the same way he'd said it before, flat, factual. Not a comfort, just a correction of a thing that wasn't accurate. She looked at her coffee. Tom was watching them both with the particular attention of a man who'd lived long enough to recognize things that people didn't announce. 2 days later, the fire started. It didn't start on their property. It started 2 ridges over somewhere in the dry timber below the upper meadow, and by the time the smoke reached them, the wind had already made the decision about which direction it was going. Toward them. Ethan saw it. First, she heard him on the porch above her, before she'd registered what she was smelling, and when she came out of the kitchen, he was already moving with the deliberate, rapid purpose of a man calculating against a clock he couldn't see. "Wet down the barn roof," he said. "The bucket's on the west side of the shed." She ran. She didn't ask whether it was natural or set. She didn't ask how bad. She ran for the buckets, and she started filling them from the cistern and hauling them up the ladder to the barn roof, with her arms burning and her lungs tightening in the smoke that was thickening faster than she'd expected. Ethan had the horses out of the barn and up to the higher shelter before she'd gotten the 3rd bucket up the ladder. He came back at a run and took the ladder from her and went up himself faster than she'd been going, and she filled buckets below and passed them up. "How close?" she called. "Close enough," he said. "Keep going." She kept going. The heat reached them before the flames were visible. A wall of radiant, pressing heat that came from the southwest and had no interest in their plans for the day. She felt it on her face, her arms. She kept filling buckets. When the fire line crested the ridge above the lower meadow, she saw it properly for the first time and understood viscerally in a way the word had not conveyed what it meant. It moved the way living things move, fast and adaptive, and looking for weakness. "Ethan?" She kept her voice steady with effort. "I see it." He was down from the roof beside her. He looked at the fire line at the barn, at the space between them, and she could see him calculating rapidly. "The roof's wet enough. It's the shed we'll lose if the wind shifts. Then we wet the shed. It's not worth—" "What's in it?" A brief pause. "Winter stores, tools, the spare saddles." "Then it's worth wetting." She picked up 2 buckets and went toward the shed. She heard him move behind her. He didn't argue. They worked the shed roof for 20 minutes, while the fire moved along the ridge above them, and the smoke turned the morning a particular brown-gray color that made it hard to judge distances. Her hands were raw. Her eyes were streaming from the smoke. At one point, she lost her footing on the shed roof and caught herself on the chimney pipe and wrenched her shoulder badly enough that she felt it clearly through the adrenaline, but not badly enough to stop. She did not stop. The wind shifted. It shifted at the moment. It would have been most catastrophic when they were halfway through the shed, and the fire was at its closest, and the air between the fire line and the property was dry and hot and hungry. It shifted south, pushed the fire line laterally, and the danger moved from acute to merely bad. They stood in the yard, her Ethan both breathing hard, both smoke-grimed, and watched the fire work its way south along the ridge until it found an area of recent burn that couldn't sustain it and began to falter. She heard him exhale. It wasn't a dramatic sound. It was just breath leaving a body that had been holding more than it should. "Your shoulder," he said. "It's fine." He looked at her in a way that made it clear he didn't believe her. "It's manageable," she corrected. He moved toward her before she fully understood what he was doing, and his hand went to her shoulder. Not grasping, just finding the joint with careful pressure, reading it the same way she'd seen him read his horses. She stood still. "Wrenched," he said. "Not torn." "That's what I said." "You said fine." Fine was approximate. His hand stayed on her shoulder for a moment longer than the assessment required. Then he lowered it and stepped back and looked at the barn, the shed, the smoldering ridge. "We kept it," he said. "We kept it," she agreed. Neither of them said what they were both aware of, that the fire had started 2 ridges over on a dry summer morning with no lightning and no visible cause. They didn't need to say it. She asked him about the betrayal that night. She hadn't planned to. She'd been sitting at the table with her wrenched shoulder aching steadily and the smell of smoke still in her hair, eating supper in a silence that had become more comfortable over the weeks than she'd expected silence to get. And then she'd looked at him and thought about the way his face had shifted when Callum rode up, and the word that had come to her on the road, "He was also in my unit," and she'd set her fork down. "What did Callum do?" she said. He looked up. "During the war," she said. "What did he do?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "There were 8 of us," he said. "Scouts. We'd been working a stretch of territory in Kansas for 4 months. Callum had the trust of the captain because he was good at looking trustworthy." He stopped. "He sold our position to a Confederate irregular unit. For money. Told them exactly where we'd be and when we'd be there." She waited. 3 men didn't come back from that ambush," he said. His voice was flat and even and controlled. 2 others came back in ways they'd have preferred not to. He looked at his hands. "I was the one who went to the captain. I was the one who put Callum's name to it." He paused. "He was court-martialed, didn't hang. I've wondered since whether I made the right decision reporting it instead of—" He stopped again. "Instead of handling it yourself," she said. "Yes, you made the right decision," she said. He looked at her. "Not because of what you owe the law," she said. "Because you're not the kind of man who could live with the other option and still be who you are." He was very still. "I've spent time with you," she said. "I know how you're built." She picked her fork back up. "He's working for Graves now. He knows your land. He knows your habits. He knows enough about you from before to know where to push." She looked at him. "What does he know that we need to worry about?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Something in him had shifted, not visibly, but in the particular way she'd learned to detect over weeks of watching a man who expressed very little outwardly. "He knows I won't leave," he said. "So they'll try to make staying impossible," she said. "Yes." "The fire was a test," she said, "to see how we'd respond, whether we'd be rattled." "That's my read." "Then we were the wrong answer for them." She met his eyes. "We kept the property, and we didn't panic. Now they know that doesn't work." He looked at her across the table. The lamp was between them again, the same as it had been every evening since she'd arrived. "Which means they'll try something else," he said. "Yes," she said. "Something that has a human target instead of a building." The words sat on the table between them. "You should know," he said carefully, "that if they find a way to threaten you specifically, I would rather you leave than—" "No," she said. He stopped. "I did not leave Millhaven to stand in a burning field and then be sent back at the first sign it gets worse," she said. "That is not the arrangement." The arrangement has changed," she said. "You know that. I know that. Let's not pretend otherwise." The silence that followed was different from the usual silences. It had something in it she didn't name, and he didn't name, and the lamp burned on regardless. "All right," he said finally. "Good," she said, and finished her supper. It was Cale Haskell who brought the news. He came up the ridge road 3 days later at a speed that told her before she could read his face that something was wrong. She was in the yard when he came through the gate, and she called for Ethan before the boy had even pulled his horse to a stop. Cale was 16, lean, with his father's eyes and his father's economy of speech. He slid off his horse and looked at her. "They went to Millhaven," he said, breathing hard. "Callum's man, the young one." Her throat went tight. "When?" "Yesterday. My cousin was in town. He saw him go into the bank." He swallowed. "And he saw him come back out with Harlan Graves." Ethan was there. He'd heard the last part. "What did your cousin see them do?" he asked. "They went to the post office," Cale said. "And then they went to the Dawson house." The yard went very quiet. Claire heard the words, and she heard what they meant, and she stood in the yard of a mountain property 2 hours from town, and thought about her mother. About Nora. About the house that was supposed to be safe now. She was moving toward the barn before she'd consciously decided to go. "Claire," Ethan's voice. "I have to go down there," she said. "I know." He was right behind her. "We go together." She stopped, turned. He was looking at her with that direct, steady look. "Together," he said again. Simple statement. No debate in it. She looked at him for a moment. She nodded. They had the horses ready in under 10 minutes. Cale offered to ride ahead and send word to his father. Ethan told him yes, and thanked him by name, which she noticed because it was the kind of thing that mattered to a 16-year-old boy who was trying to be useful, and Ethan seemed to understand that without having to think about it. They rode hard. The mountain road down was steep enough that hard was a relative term, fast enough to feel the urgency, careful enough not to kill the horses on the switchbacks. She rode beside him, and he let her set the pace on the straightaways, and slowed when she slowed on the turns, and neither of them talked because there was nothing to say that was more useful than getting there quickly. She thought about what Graves could want with her mother. He had the debt certificate. He had the signed agreement. The legal claim on the house was settled. But Harlan Graves, she was beginning to understand, was not primarily interested in legal mechanisms. Legal mechanisms were just the first thing he tried. After that, he moved to the kind of pressure that didn't leave marks that a judge could read. Her mother was gentle. She was frightened. She was the kind of woman who would open a door to a man in a suit because she'd been raised to believe that men in suits deserved the door to be opened. She rode faster. Millhaven looked the same as it always had, which struck her as almost offensive. The same dusty street, the same barber shop, the same window, with Frances Tillman's nose pressed to the glass. Things that felt like they should be altered by what had been happening didn't alter themselves for anyone's convenience. She rode straight to her mother's house. Margaret Dawson, or before Claire had dismounted, which meant she'd been watching the street. Claire. Her mother's voice had the particular high, thin quality it got when she'd been frightened and was trying not to show it in front of company. "Are you all right?" Claire asked, coming up the steps. "Yes. Yes, we're—" Margaret stopped looking past her at Ethan. Something moved across her face. "Mr. Boone?" "Mrs. Dawson." He'd dismounted and tied both horses. He was standing at the base of the steps with his hat in his hands. "A man came here," Claire said. Her mother's face confirmed it. "Yesterday afternoon," Margaret said. "He was very polite. Said he represented the bank. Said there was an irregularity in the debt certificate." She pressed her hands together. "He said the transfer might not have been legally completed, that there might be additional claims." Claire felt the anger move through her in that cold, slow way it did. "Did he leave anything? Any documents?" "He left a letter," Margaret said. "I didn't sign it. He said I didn't need to sign it yet." She went inside and came back with an envelope. Ethan was up the steps beside her. He read the letter over Claire's shoulder without touching it, and she felt him still. She read it herself. It was carefully written, the language just ambiguous enough, the claims just specific enough to create genuine legal-sounding uncertainty about whether the debt certificate had been properly executed. It referenced 2 sections of territorial law that would have required someone with legal training to evaluate. It referenced a forthcoming review by a county officer. It was, she recognized after the third read, almost entirely fabricated. But fabricated in a way that her mother, who was not trained in law, who was frightened, who wanted this to be over, might have found convincing enough to consider complying with whatever came next. "He's trying to reinstate the leverage," she said. Ethan's voice came from beside her, quiet and certain. "He's trying to make your mother afraid enough to pressure you." She looked up. "Through me." "Through you," he confirmed. Her mother was watching them both. "What does it mean?" she said. "Claire, what does it actually mean? Is the house—" "The house is safe," Claire said. She made her voice deliberate and steady, because her mother needed that more than she needed accuracy right now, and what she was saying was accurate. "This letter has no legal standing. It is designed to look like it does. It doesn't." Margaret's hands were trembling slightly. "How do you know?" she whispered. "Because I've been paying attention," Claire said, "and because the man who helped us knows what Harlan Graves does and how he does it." She looked at Ethan. "Tell her." He looked at Margaret Dawson. He spoke clearly and without condescension. He explained what the letter referenced, why the territorial law it cited didn't apply, what a legitimate debt review would actually require, by way of documentation, and why the absence of any court seal meant this was a private communication with no legal compulsion behind it. He spoke for about 4 minutes. When he was done, Margaret's hands had stopped shaking. "He's bluffing," Margaret said slowly. "He's bluffing," Ethan confirmed. "But he'll try again," Margaret said. "Yes, ma'am, he likely will." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Claire watched her mother look at Ethan Boone the way her mother looked at people she was deciding about taking in details, with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who'd spent 40 years learning to read the ones who mattered. "You came down the mountain fast," Margaret said. "When Claire heard about the visit, yes, ma'am. She asked you to come. We came together," he said. Margaret looked between the two of them. She looked back at Ethan. "Thank you," she said. "For the letter, for coming, for—" She stopped. "For being the kind of man who does those things." His jaw shifted. "I'm doing what's right, ma'am. That's all." "That's quite a lot," Margaret said quietly. "In my experience." They stayed for 2 hours. Claire sat with her mother in the kitchen while Ethan sat on the porch with Nora, who had emerged from her room with the cautious assessment of a 16-year-old deciding whether to trust a stranger. Within 20 minutes of sitting beside him, she was doing most of the talking, which was either a tribute to Nora's personality or evidence that Ethan had a quality that people who felt overlooked responded to without being able to explain why. He listened. He answered her questions directly. He didn't talk to her like she was a child. Claire could hear the murmur of the conversation through the kitchen window. "He's a good man," her mother said quietly, not looking up from her hands. "I know," Claire said. "Do you?" Margaret looked at her. "Because knowing something and believing it are different things, and you've always been better at knowing." Claire looked at the table. "I'm working on the believing part." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "He came down a mountain fast for you." "For us." Claire. Margaret's voice was gentle and firm in equal measure. "I was watching his face when Cale's news reached him, when he thought something might have happened to your family." She paused. "He came down that mountain fast for you." Claire said nothing. "Is it so hard to let someone do that?" her mother asked. She didn't have an answer for that, so she folded her hands on the table and watched the light move across the kitchen floor and thought about a man who'd said the bed is yours on the first night and hadn't made it about anything other than what was right since. They rode back as the afternoon light was going long and gold over the valley. She was quiet for the first mile. He let her be. "We need to do something about Graves directly," she said. "I know. Not defensively. Not responding to what he sends." She looked at the road. "Taking something to him that he can't counter." Ethan was quiet. "The death certificate," she said. "He engineered it. He had my father's signatures on things my father didn't understand. That's not a creative accounting problem, that's fraud." She looked at him. "Is there a federal land office with jurisdiction here?" Ethan's pace on the horse changed, not dramatically, just a small adjustment of the seat that meant his mind had engaged with what she was saying. "Denver," he said. "Federal land office handles territorial disputes and fraudulent debt instruments. If they cross county lines, yes, Graves operates out of Denver. His transactions go through 3 counties." He paused. "A territorial judge could take jurisdiction. Do you have documentation on the offers he made for your land? The rejections any of his men's visits?" "Some," he said. "Not enough." "Then we get more," she said. "Tom Haskell, Denny Frost, anyone else Graves has tried this with. We compile it. We find every transaction that crosses those county lines, and we document it in a way that can't be dismissed as one man's complaint against a banker." He looked at her. "You're talking about building a case," he said. "I'm a school teacher," she said. "I grade papers. I know how to build something that has to hold up under examination." He was quiet for a long time. The road climbed back toward the mountains, and the air cooled around them, and the horses found their rhythm. "If we go to the federal land office," he said, "Graves will know. He has friends in Denver." "How long before he knows?" "A week, maybe. Then we file and we're back on the mountain before he can respond." She looked at him. "Can we get enough documentation in 3 days?" "Haskell and Frost in 1 day," he said slowly. "The county records office in Millhaven has the original deed filings. Those are public record. If someone who knew what they were looking for went through them." "I know what I'm looking for," she said. He stopped talking. She watched the mountains above them. "There's a lawyer in Denver," she said. "His name is Samuel Weir. He taught the territorial bar exam. He has a reputation for taking land fraud cases." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I spent 3 weeks before I met you trying to find a legal solution to my family's situation," she said. "I read everything I could find. I wrote 3 letters. 2 of them were returned unread." A pause. "The 3rd one was answered. Weir told me the debt certificate was legal on its face, and there was nothing he could do without evidence of fraud at the origination." Ethan was very still. "You've been working this problem since before you came to the mountain," he said. "I told you," she said quietly. "I was a school teacher. We don't give up on problems. We find a better approach." He looked at the road ahead of them. She watched his profile. "All right," he said. 3 days. Then from behind them, from somewhere on the lower road they'd just come from, she heard a gunshot. Single, sharp. Then nothing. They both pulled their horses around immediately. The road below was empty. The evening light was clean and still. Nothing moved. But she saw it, a thin line of smoke, rising from the direction of the Dawson house. Her mother's house. Her heart stopped. Then the smoke thickened. And she was already turning her horse and pressing it hard, before Ethan had finished saying her name. She rode hard enough that her hands went numb on the reins. The smoke was real. She could smell it before she could see it clearly, that particular wrong smell of something burning that shouldn't be the kind that gets into the back of your throat and stays. Her horse found the rhythm she asked for, and she didn't think about the road or the switchbacks, or the way the light was going. She thought about her mother's hands trembling around a cup. She thought about Nora sitting on that porch talking to Ethan like she'd finally found someone worth talking to. Ethan was beside her the whole way down. Not ahead of her, beside her. The fire was in the storage shed behind the house. Not the house itself, not yet, but the shed where Margaret kept the winter preserves, and Thomas Dawson's old tools, and the extra linens she'd refused to sell, even when money was its tightest. The shed was small and wooden and dry, and it was burning with the focused intensity of something that had been helped along. Nora was in the yard with a bucket when they came through the gate. She'd already been working it alone, her face red from heat and effort, her hair loose from its pins. "Mama's inside," she said the moment she saw Claire. "I couldn't get her to come out. She kept saying the linens." Claire was off her horse before it had fully stopped. She went through the back door and found her mother in the kitchen pressing wet cloths to her face against the smoke, trying to gather things from the shelf nearest the window. "Mama!" Claire took her by both arms. "Leave it. Come outside. Your father's ledgers are on that shelf. Come outside right now." She got her mother out the door and into the yard and sat her on the garden bench with Nora beside her, and then she turned and looked at the shed. Ethan had the situation read in the 30 seconds she'd been inside. He'd stripped his jacket and was using it to beat back the edge nearest the house, keeping the fire from the gap between the shed wall and the kitchen garden fence. She grabbed the second bucket from where Nora had set it and filled it at the yard pump and threw it where it would do the most good. They worked the fire for 20 minutes. It was smaller than the ridge fire, more controlled, more deliberate. Meant to damage rather than destroy. Meant to send a message. The shed was a total loss. The house was untouched. When the last of the fire was out, she stood in the yard with her hands at her sides and ash in her hair and looked at the charred frame of the shed and felt something settle in her that was past anger. Anger moved. This didn't move. This was something that had found its place and intended to stay until it was resolved. Ethan was beside her. "The gunshot," she said. Her voice was even. "Signal," he said. "One man to set the fire, one watching the road to signal when we were clear of town. They waited until we left." "Yes." She turned to look at him. "They were watching us ride out." "Yes." "Which means someone in town reported to them." He nodded. "That's been true for a while. I just didn't know who." She turned back to the shed. Her mother was crying quietly on the bench with Nora's arm around her, and the sound of it was the specific sound of a person who has held themselves together past their limit and has run out of the ability to hold. "I'm not sending them back up the mountain," she said. "No," he agreed. "They need to be somewhere Graves can't reach them directly." She looked at him. Tom Haskell's place. Would he take them for a week, 2? "Yes," he said without hesitation. "He would. Can you ride to him tonight? I'll go now." She nodded. He went to his horse. "Ethan!" She said it before she'd decided to. He turned. She looked at him across the yard in the fading light with ash on both of them and the smell of burning in the air. Thank you, she said. Just that. He looked at her for a moment. Don't thank me yet, he said. We're not done. He rode. Dad. She spent the next hour with her mother. Margaret Dawson was not a woman who fell apart easily. People who hadn't known her long often thought she was, because she cried openly and her hands shook when she was frightened. But those were surface things. Underneath them, she had the same spine that Claire had just expressed differently, worn smoother by years of working around a man who couldn't face hard truths. She told her mother the truth. All of it, the land fraud, the pattern of intimidation, what she and Ethan had been building toward. She told it plainly, without softening the difficult parts, because her mother deserved the information she'd been denied for too long. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. How long have you been working on this? She asked. Since before I went up the mountain, Claire said, and every day since. You didn't write. I didn't want to worry you before I had something solid. Margaret looked at her hands. That's what your father used to say. The words landed cleanly. Claire absorbed them. I know, she said. The difference is that I'm telling you now. Her mother looked up. Yes, she said. You are. She was quiet for another moment. Tom Haskell is a good man. He helped your father with the hay baling 2 years before he died. She pressed her lips together. I'll go. Nora too. But Claire... She stopped. I'm not coming with you, Claire said. I know. Her mother's voice was resigned and something else, something that wasn't resignation, something that might have been respect. I know you're not. Nora was less accepting. She came into the kitchen when Margaret went upstairs to pack, and she stood across the table from Claire with her arms crossed, and the particular expression of a 16-year-old who has decided she is owed an explanation. You're going back up there, Nora said. Yes. And you're going to do something about graves? Yes. Let me come. No. Nora's jaw set. I'm not... Nora. Claire leaned forward, both hands flat on the table. I need you with Mama. Not because you can't handle more. Because she can't, and she needs someone who knows her. That is a real job. That is the job I need done. Her sister looked at her. You sound different, she said. Claire looked back at her. I am different. Nora uncrossed her arms. She came around the table and put her arms around Claire, the way she had in the bank all those weeks ago, and Claire held her and thought about how much had changed since that morning, and how much was still left to resolve. Is he good? Nora said against her shoulder. The mountain man. Is he actually good? Claire thought about the first night, and the blanket on the floor, and the coffee, and the first question she'd asked, and the way he'd answered it. She thought about her shoulder, and his hands, and the fence, and the fire, and riding down the mountain fast beside her the whole way. Yes, she said. He's actually good. Ethan came back with Tom Haskell 2 hours later. Tom came into the kitchen with his hat in his hands and his manner direct and warm in the way of a man who'd had enough loss to know what other people's loss felt like. He sat with Margaret for a few minutes and talked to her about nothing complicated: the weather, the condition of the lower road, whether she'd be comfortable in his spare room, and something in her mother's shoulders came down from around her ears by the time he was done. They left before full dark. Tom's wagon. Nora up front beside him, Margaret in the bed with the things she'd packed, and a quilt Ethan had brought down from the mountain without being asked. Claire stood in the road and watched the wagon until it turned the corner. She stood there for a moment after. Then she turned around. Ethan was leaning against the fence post 10 feet away, watching her. County Records office opens at 8, he said. I know. We should stay in town tonight. Start at opening. She looked at the house. All right. He pushed off the fence post. I'll see to the horses. She went back inside into the kitchen that still smelled faintly of smoke from the shed, and she sat at her mother's table in her mother's chair and looked at the shelf where Thomas Dawson's ledger sat and thought about all the things her father hadn't said, and all the damage silence could do, moving quietly through a family like water, through a foundation invisible, until the wall came down. She pulled the ledgers from the shelf and opened the first one. If there was something in them, any record of what Graves had told him, any note of the original transaction, any evidence that was actually for, she was going to find it tonight. She lit the lamp and got to work. She found it at 10:30. It wasn't obvious. Her father had not been a meticulous record keeper. The ledgers were inconsistent, more personal journal than financial document, with entries that wandered between crop yields and notes about the weather, and occasional sentences that seemed to be addressed to no one in particular. But he'd recorded the meetings, all three of them, all three. The first was a year and a half before he died, a meeting at the bank, described in Thomas Dawson's cramped handwriting as a loan for improvements on the south fence and the hay equipment. The amount matched what Graves had cited in the debt certificate. The second was 8 months later, a meeting Claire hadn't known about, recorded as a refinancing. A larger number, a different term. Her father had written beside it in smaller letters. Harlan says this consolidates the earlier note. It should be simpler this way. The third was 4 months before Thomas Dawson rode his horse off a road he'd ridden 100 times and ended up at the bottom of a ravine. She read that entry 3 times. Her father had written, "Harlan came to the property today. I told him I was not comfortable with the terms of the second note. He showed me a document I did not sign. He said it didn't matter whether I recognized the signature. He said the bank's records would reflect what they reflected, and there was nothing I could do about it. I don't know what to do. I cannot tell Margaret. It would kill her to know how badly I have managed this." She sat very still for a long time. The document her father hadn't signed, the signature that didn't matter, the bank's records reflecting what Graves needed them to reflect. That wasn't debt. That was extortion, built on a forged document. She heard Ethan come in from the back. He came through the kitchen doorway and stopped when he saw her face. "What did you find?" he said. She turned the ledger so he could read it. He read it. She watched his face go through something not dramatic, but real, a tightening around the jaw, a controlled stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. "He forged a document," Ethan said. "He forged a document," she confirmed. "And then he used the threat of that document to prevent my father from contesting the note." She looked at the entry. "My father didn't fall off that road by accident." The words came out steadier than she felt. Ethan looked at her. "You don't know that," he said carefully. "I know my father rode that road 100 times, she said. "I know he was frightened. I know Graves had come to the property 4 months before and told him there was nothing he could do." She looked up. "I don't have proof, but I know." He held her gaze. He didn't offer false comfort. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He sat across the table from her and let her say it, and treated it with the seriousness it deserved. "Then we put everything in front of the Federal Land Office," he said. "The ledger, the pattern with Haskell and Frost, the fraudulent debt certificate, the intimidation." He paused. "Samuel Weir." "Yes," she said. "You'll have to testify." "I know. It'll be public." "Good," she said. "I want it public." He looked at her in the lamplight. "You've changed since the first day," he said. "It wasn't a judgment, just an observation." "I'm the same person I was," she said. "I just know more now." He was quiet for a moment. "The first day, in the bank. Were you afraid?" She considered lying. It would have been easy, and she had gotten very good at holding her face still when she needed to. "Yes," she said. "I was terrified. Of me. Of all of it." She looked at him. "Of you a little. I didn't know what kind of man you were." "And now?" "Now I know," she said. He looked at the ledger between them. Something moved through his face that he didn't manage entirely, a kind of loosening around the eyes that she recognized because she'd been watching his face for weeks now, and she knew the difference between his ordinary stillness and this. "Get some rest," he said. "We start at 8. The county records office smelled like old paper and the particular mustiness of documents that contained other people's disasters. Claire had always liked the smell of paper. She liked it less this morning. The clerk was a small, precise man named Albright, who wore his authority in his posture and examined their request for deed records with the suspicious attention of someone who had not been asked this before and wasn't sure whether he approved of being asked it now. "Boone property records," he said slowly. "And the Haskell parcel. And the Frost homestead. And any transfers involving Graves Financial," Claire said pleasantly. "That's filed under Commercial Transactions Section 4, if I'm not mistaken." Albright looked at her. "I was a school teacher," she said. "I read the county charter for interest." He went and got the files. She spent 3 hours going through them while Ethan sat beside her and the clerk moved around them with ostentatious busyness. She read every deed transfer, every lien filing, every commercial transaction that had Graves's name on it. And she wrote notes in the small journal she'd brought in her jacket pocket. And she built the shape of what Graves had been doing in this county for the past 4 years, with the same methodical attention she'd used to build a lesson plan that would hold up through a room full of children who'd rather be doing anything else. What she found was worse than she'd expected. Graves hadn't done this to 3 families. He'd done it to 11. Some had sold, some had left. Some had records that stopped abruptly with no subsequent filing, which meant either they'd moved out of the county completely or there was something else she didn't have access to. She set the 11th file down and looked at Ethan. "He's been building a land corridor," she said quietly. "Look at the properties. Every parcel he's acquired in the last 4 years, they're not random. They form a path from the valley floor to the upper mountain." She traced the pattern with her finger on the notes she'd made. "He's not collecting land, he's securing a route." Ethan looked at the notes. His jaw shifted. "For the mineral extraction," he said. "He doesn't need the gold on your property," she said. "Or if he does, it's secondary. What he needs is the right-of-way. The access path to the upper ridge where the real vein is." She looked up. "Your land sits directly across the only viable approach." The room felt very still. "That's why he's been so persistent," Ethan said, "and why he's willing to escalate to fire and forgery and whatever happened to my father," she said. "He's been planning this for years. Every parcel he acquired was a step. Your land is the last one." She gathered her notes and closed her journal. "We ride to Denver," she said. "Today." Kid. They sent word to Tom Haskell through Cale, who appeared at the records office doorway at 11 with the punctuality of a boy who'd been waiting for exactly the right moment to be useful. He listened to the message, repeated it back correctly, and disappeared back down the street before Albright noticed he'd been there. They had the horses provisioned by noon. Claire had her father's ledger wrapped in oilcloth in her saddlebag and the journal of notes in her jacket pocket, and she felt for the first time since this whole thing had begun that she was carrying something that could actually do damage to the right people. They were at the edge of town when the sheriff stepped out of his office. He was a man named Cordell, who had been sheriff of this county for 12 years, and had in that time managed to cultivate a detailed ignorance of everything Harlan Graves did that Cordell would have preferred not to know about. "Boone," he said. He looked at Claire. "Mrs. Boone." "Sheriff," Ethan said. "Heard there was a fire at the Dawson property last night." "There was," Ethan said. "Storage shed. Total loss." Cordell looked at him. "Any idea of the cause?" "The cause was deliberate," Ethan said. "I expect you'll hear more about that from the Federal Land Office in Denver within the week." Cordell's expression moved through several things in a short time. Federal Land Office doesn't have jurisdiction over... They do over land fraud that crosses county lines, Claire said, and over intimidation of witnesses to federal land proceedings. She watched him absorb the word witnesses. "I'd advise not losing any relevant files while we're gone," she said. "Records that disappear after a federal inquiry is opened tend to reflect poorly on the offices that were holding them." She said it pleasantly. Schoolteacher pleasant. The kind that left no room to pretend you hadn't understood. Cordell looked at her for a long moment. "Safe travels, Mrs. Boone," he said. They rode out. Denver was 2 days' ride. They stopped the first night at a way station where the proprietor was a woman named Gertrude who asked no questions and made good coffee and had the particular self-possessed someone who had built exactly the life she intended. Claire liked her immediately. They ate at the same table and talked over the case. Claire had the notes spread between the plates, and Ethan was making additions from his own memory conversations with Haskell, dates of the visits from Graves's men, the specific language Callum had used in his approaches, and she was writing everything down. At some point, Gertrude brought more coffee and looked at the two of them bent over the notes and didn't say anything, just set the coffee down and walked away. "Tell me about the army again," Claire said. "Not Callum, the rest of it." He looked up. "Why?" "Because I want to know who I'm riding to Denver with," she said. "The real version. Not the summary you think is sufficient." He was quiet for a moment. "I enlisted at 19, he said. "Same as most. I was good at moving through landscape without being seen. That's what scouts do." He turned his cup on the table. "I spent 4 years watching things happen that I didn't have the rank to prevent. I came out of it with the understanding that the law only works if someone makes it work." He paused. "I bought the mountain property because I needed somewhere that was mine and nobody else's." "And then Graves came after it," she said. "And then Graves came after it." "Did you ever think about just selling before all this started?" "No." "Not once?" "No." He looked at her. "Some things you don't give up. Not because of what they're worth, because of what giving them up makes you." She looked at him across the table. "My father gave up," she said. "He couldn't face it, so he went quiet, and the quiet killed him." She paused. "I used to think it was weakness. Now I think it was just—" She stopped. "He didn't have anyone beside him. He thought he was protecting us by carrying it alone." "He was wrong," Ethan said. "He was wrong," she agreed. "But he loved us. He was just wrong and alone with it." She looked at her notes. "I think that's the difference," she said. "Being wrong and alone with it versus being wrong and having someone who'll tell you so." He was looking at her in a way she felt but didn't quite meet. "You've told me I was wrong twice," he said. "In 5 weeks. You were wrong twice in 5 weeks." Something moved in his face. Not a smile adjacent to one closer than usual. "What were the 2 times? Not telling me about the men on the road on day 1, she said, and telling me to leave when Callum came." "That second one, I'd argue." "You can argue it," she said. "You'd still be wrong." He looked at his coffee. The thing that had almost been a smile settled into something else, something quieter and more permanent than a smile. "You're planning to go back to the mountain," he said, "after this is resolved." It wasn't quite a question. She looked at the notes in front of her. "Are you asking whether I'm planning to leave?" "I'm asking what you want," he said. "Not what the arrangement requires. What you want." She looked up. He met her eyes with the directness he gave everything. No performance, no management, just the plain question exactly as he'd asked it. She thought about the morning light over the ridge. She thought about coffee and fence lines and a 16-year-old boy running trap lines to help people he barely knew. She thought about the barn and the rain and his hands on her shoulder and the way he'd said is every time she used was. "I want to finish the fence section we started on the north side," she said. "We left it half done." He looked at her. "And I'd like to teach," she said. "The children on the lower ridge, if the offer stands." He held her gaze for a long moment. "It stands," he said. She looked back at her notes. "Then we finish this in Denver," she said, "and we go back and finish the fence." He didn't say anything else. He turned his coffee cup on the table, once deliberate and slow, and then went back to telling her what she needed to know about the dates and the conversations and the evidence that was going to matter. Get there. Samuel Weir was not what she'd expected. She had expected a polished Denver lawyer who would make her explain the mountain in terms he found comprehensible. She'd prepared for that, had organized her notes in the order most useful for someone who thought in legal frameworks rather than human ones. What she got instead was a short, direct man in his 60s who read her notes in silence for 20 minutes while they sat in his office and then set them down and looked at her over his spectacles. "This is Graves," he said. "The corridor theory." "Yes." "You verified this in the county records." "I have the copies I made." He looked at Ethan. "And you have the ledger." "Her father's ledger," Ethan said. "Entry dated 4 months before his death." Weir looked back at Claire. "Your father fell from a road he knew. 4 months after Graves told him there was nothing he could do," she said. "Yes." Weir took his spectacles off and cleaned them with the particular deliberateness of a man who thinks better when his hands are occupied. "I've been watching Graves for 2 years," he said. "I had complaints from 3 landholders, not enough to file. What you've brought me." He looked at the notes again. 11 parcels, a forged document in a death estate, a federal access corridor being assembled without easement filing. He put his spectacles back on. "This is enough to file." She felt something release in her chest. "The territorial judge holds session in 3 weeks, Weir said. "I can have the filing in his hands by end of this week if you're willing to sign the complaint." "Both of us," she said and looked at Ethan. He nodded. "Both of us," he confirmed. Weir looked between them. He had the look of a man who had heard a great many stories in his office and had learned to read the ones that ran underneath the ones people said out loud. "How long have you two been up on that mountain?" he said. 5 weeks, Claire said. Weir nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's build this." They were in Denver for 3 days. On the morning of the second day, Callum found them. She didn't know how. She'd been careful about which streets they used. Ethan had been careful about where they stabled the horses, choosing a yard operated by a man he knew from his army years, rather than a public stable. But Callum had spent years moving through difficult territory without being seen, and he'd had someone in Denver watching Weir's office, and the fact that they hadn't thought of that was the mistake she'd look back on later and catalog alongside all the other things she now knew. She came out of the office supply shop where she'd bought extra paper for the filing documents and found him standing on the boardwalk 10 feet away. He was alone. That was interesting and didn't necessarily mean anything good. "Mrs. Boone," he said. She stopped. She didn't run through the options. She understood immediately with the cold clarity that had replaced her old version of fear that running through options was for people who hadn't committed to a direction yet. She'd committed. "Mr. Callum," she said. He looked at the package under her arm. "Supply shopping," he said. "Productive trip." "Very." She looked at him. "What do you want?" He stepped closer, not threatening, projecting the performance of friendliness that she understood now was the face he used when he was actually being threatening. "Graves is prepared to be generous," he said. "To both of you. Real money. Enough to buy property elsewhere. Somewhere without all this difficulty." "No," she said. He looked at her. "You haven't heard the number." "I don't need to hear the number." "Mrs. Boone." "The complaint is filed," she said. "The territorial judge has the documents. Samuel Weir has copies of everything, and so does a third party whose name I'm not going to tell you." She kept her voice perfectly level. "There is no number Graves can offer that changes what happens next." Something went through Callum's face. Not the performance of friendliness. The actual response of a man who'd played a long game and just heard the board tip. "You don't know what kind of man Graves is," he said. His voice had changed. "I know exactly what kind of man he is," she said. "The question is, what kind of man you are." He stilled. "You betrayed 8 men in the war," she said. 3 of them didn't come back. You did it for money." She looked at him steadily. "Is that the life you chose or the one you fell into? Because there's a territorial judge in 3 weeks who's going to be asking similar questions, and the answer you give might be the difference between where you end up." Callum's jaw moved. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen in his face before. Not anger, not calculation. Something that was further back than either of those. "Walk away from Graves," she said, "before this closes." She walked around him and back toward Weir's office. She heard him stand there for a moment. She didn't look back. When she got inside, Ethan was at the desk with Weir reviewing the filing documents. He looked up when she came in. She set the paper on the desk. "Callum's outside," she said. Ethan was out of his chair before she'd finished the sentence. "He's alone," she said quickly. "He didn't threaten me. He made another offer." She paused. "I told him to walk away from Graves." Ethan stopped. He looked at her. "I think he might," she said. "I think he's been carrying what he did in the war for a long time, and it hasn't gotten lighter." She paused. "That's not forgiveness. That's just an observation." Ethan looked at her for a moment, in that particular way that had no surplus in it, that was just him seeing her clearly. "You said the complaint is filed," he said. "The third party." "Tom Haskell," she said. "I sent him copies yesterday. I didn't tell Callum who it was, just that someone had them." Weir, who'd been listening with professional composure, looked up from the documents. "That was smart. The students who paid attention in school usually are," she said. On the morning of the third day, something happened that changed everything. Weir called them into his office before the records office had opened, which meant he had heard something that couldn't wait. He sat across from them with the particular expression of a lawyer who has received information he knows is significant and has spent the night deciding how to frame it. "I have a contact in the county assessor's office in Denver," he said. "He reached out to me last night." He looked at the document on his desk. "Graves has been in communication with a railroad surveying company. Private correspondence not filed. My contact came across it in the course of his work." Claire felt the thing she'd been building in her mind shift and reorganize. "The corridor," she said, "isn't for mineral extraction," Weir confirmed. "It's for a rail line, privately held. The route goes through the exact parcel sequence you identified in the county records." He looked at her. "The mineral talk is a cover. What Graves is selling to investors is rail access to the upper ridge. There's no significant gold vein on Boone's property, never was. But if a rail line runs through it, the land value increases tenfold, and the construction contracts are worth 3 times that." The room was very quiet. "He's been lying to his own investors," Ethan said. "About the gold, yes," Weir said. "Using it to secure the purchases while the real purpose stays private." He set down the document. "This changes the nature of the fraud significantly. We're not talking about a land grab for mineral rights. We're talking about securities fraud, investor deception. The territorial judge doesn't have jurisdiction over that, but the federal circuit court does." Claire looked at Ethan. He looked at her. "Federal circuit court," she said. "Means a longer process," Weir said. "But it also means a higher charge, a larger net, and Graves has no friends at the federal level who can redirect this." He looked at them both. "Are you willing to extend this?" She thought about 11 families, about properties with records that stopped abruptly, about a man who'd ridden a familiar road and didn't come back. She looked at Ethan. "Yes," she said. He turned to Weir. "Yes," he said. Weir nodded. He picked up his pen. Outside the office window, Denver went about its morning indifferent to the specific architecture of justice being assembled in this room by 2 people from a mountain and a lawyer who'd been waiting 2 years for something that could hold. Claire reached across the desk for the copy of the railroad correspondence. She read it once slowly all the way through. She set it down. "He's going to know we have this today," she said, "the moment your contact realizes it's missing." "Yes," Weir said. "How fast can he move if he decides to run?" "He's not going to run," Weir said. "Men like Graves don't run. They counterattack." He looked at them both. "Which means the next 48 hours are the most dangerous ones." She looked at Ethan. He was already looking at her. "Tom Haskell," she said. "I'll send word today," he said. "And Cale on the ridge." "Yes." She looked at the filing documents on Weir's desk. her name on them. Ethan's name beside hers. The sworn statement in her father's handwriting wrapped in oilcloth that had traveled from a dead man's shelf to a federal case that might finally mean something. She thought about what Graves would do in the next 48 hours. She thought about what they had and what they'd need. Then she thought about something else. Something she'd missed sitting at the edge of everything she'd been thinking about for 3 days, waiting for her to notice it. "The young writer," she said. "The one who called himself Dawson." Ethan looked at her. "He was watching us that day in the yard," she said. "When Callum visited the property, he stayed back and watched us after the others left." She looked at Ethan. "He saw something." "What do you mean?" "The way Callum came to me in Denver alone with an offer, not a threat. That's not how he operated before." She thought it through. "He's seen something that changed his calculation, something about us specifically, something that told him a direct threat wouldn't work." Ethan was very still. "He saw that you weren't alone anymore," she said quietly. "And he understood what that meant." She held Ethan's gaze. "He knew that threatening me wouldn't move you toward selling," she said. "It would move you toward something else entirely." She paused. "And he was right." The words sat between them in the morning light of Weir's office. Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was the flat, even tone he used for true things. "Yes," he said. He was right. The ride back from Denver was different from every other ride they'd taken. It wasn't faster. If anything, it was slower. The horses were tired, and the road was long, and neither of them pushed it. But something in the quality of the silence between them had changed the way air changes before a storm that turns out not to come settling instead into something clearer and more honest than what was there before. She knew what she'd said in Weir's office. She knew what he'd confirmed. Neither of them had done anything with it since, had not circled back to it, had not made it into something larger than it was. But it was there between them, the way real things are. They're not requiring discussion to exist. They were a day out from Denver when he said it. They'd stopped to water the horses at a creek crossing, and she was standing with her boots at the edge of the water, watching it move, when she heard him come up beside her. Not close, a few feet. The particular distance he always held that was respectful without being remote. "I need to tell you something," he said. She turned to look at him. "Before we go back," he said. "Before it's settled. I want to say it when there's no tactical reason to." She waited. "I didn't come down from that mountain only because of Harlan Graves," he said. He looked at the water. "I came down because I'd heard about Thomas Dawson's family, about his daughters." He stopped. "About the schoolteacher." She was very still. "I'd heard enough to know what kind of woman you were before I ever walked into that bank," he said. "And I told myself that was coincidence, that the debt was the reason and everything else was beside the point." He looked at her. "I was lying to myself." The water moved between them and the bank on the other side. "Ethan," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said immediately. "The arrangement is the arrangement. I'm not using what I just said to pressure." "Stop," she said. He stopped. She looked at him. At the face she had learned over 5 weeks, the way you learn landscape, not all at once, but in layers, each one revealing something the last one hadn't shown. She looked at the lines around his eyes, and the set of his jaw, and the particular way he held himself when he was being honest, which was the same way he held himself always because he didn't have another way. "I know what kind of man you are," she said. "I told my sister that 5 weeks in. I told her, yes, actually good, not performing goodness, not goodness as strategy, actually good." She paused. "I don't say things I don't mean." He held her gaze. "I came down from that mountain in my head before I came down it in fact," she said. "When Cale brought the news. When I thought about my mother and Nora." She looked at the water. "But there was a half-second before I was thinking about them. A half-second where the thing I felt was about you, and what might have happened to you, and whether you were all right." She heard him breathe. "I didn't examine that too closely at the time," she said. "I had more urgent things." She looked back at him. I'm examining it now. He looked at her for a long moment. The fence, he said finally. The north section. We should finish it, she said. Yes, he said. We should. That was all. It was enough, not because they were restrained or afraid, but because they were both people who knew the difference between what you say and what you mean, and what they meant was already fully said. He went back to the horses. She followed. They crossed the creek and rode north toward the mountains, and didn't need anything else from that conversation, because it had done what it was supposed to do. Tom Haskell met them at the lower ridge road with Cale beside him, and a look on his face that said news had moved faster than they had. Callum came to Millhaven yesterday, Tom said before they'd fully pulled up. She felt it, the sharpening. What did he do? Ethan asked. Went to the sheriff's office first, spent an hour, came out and rode to the bank. Tom's jaw shifted. Then he rode out of town north, not back toward Denver, up toward the upper ridge. She looked at Ethan. He's not working for Graves anymore, she said. Both men looked at her. He went to the sheriff, she said. That's not what you do if you're still protecting your employer. That's what you do if you've decided which side of this you're standing on. She paused. Or if you're trying to get ahead of what's coming. Tom looked skeptical. Man like Callum doesn't change sides without a reason. He has a reason, she said. She thought about his face on that Denver boardwalk, the thing that had been further back than anger or calculation. He's been carrying 3 dead men for 20 years. At some point, the weight gets to be more than the money. Cale had been listening with the focused attention of a boy who'd earned his place in this conversation through 3 weeks of writing trap lines at dawn. He looked at his father. Tom looked back at him. He left something at the sheriff's office, Cale said. My cousin works the morning sweep. He said Cordell came out looking like he'd swallowed something that disagreed with him. A statement, she said. Everyone looked at her. Callum left a statement, she said, about Graves, about what he knows. She looked at Ethan. That's what the 48 hours were about. That's why Weir said they were the most dangerous. Graves would know what we were filing, and anyone who might turn against him would know the window was closing. She turned to Tom. Where did Cordell go after? Rode out toward Denver, Tom said. Yesterday afternoon, with 2 deputies. She looked at Ethan. He was already looking at her. He's filing something of his own, he said, before the federal circuit gets there and it's out of his hands completely. He's trying to get ahead of it, she said. Same as Callum. Tom looked between them. Is that good or bad? Good, she said. It means the center is collapsing. When people start running for the exits, it means they've accepted that the structure isn't going to hold. They were back at the mountain property by late afternoon. She walked through the cabin first. She didn't know exactly why something in her needed to confirm that it was as she'd left it, that the 3 days away hadn't changed anything that mattered. The kitchen, the table, the lamp on the shelf, the ledger she'd left copies of the originals now safely with Weir, the shelf where the coffee tin sat, the window that faced west, all of it intact. She put her bag down and started the fire in the stove because the afternoon had turned cold, the way mountain afternoons did suddenly and without apology. She heard him in the barn settling the horses. She heard the sounds she'd learned over 5 weeks, the specific movements of a man finishing the last tasks of his day, in a space that was his, and she made coffee and set a cup on the table. He came in and looked at the cup and sat down and wrapped both hands around it. They didn't talk for a while. The fire ticked. The coffee was strong. Outside, the summer evening settled over the ridge. What happens now? She said. With the federal case. Weir estimates 6 to 8 weeks before the circuit court convenes, he said. He'll handle the filings. Our job is to be available if they need testimony. And Graves in the meantime. He can't move against us without making his situation worse, Ethan said. Cordell is cooperating with the federal inquiry, whatever his motives. Callum's statement is on record. Every move Graves makes now is documented. He paused. He's boxed. She looked at her coffee. My father's death, she said. Will they look at it? I asked Weir, he said. He said the investigative scope can be extended if there's documented evidence of pattern behavior around property acquisition. He looked at her. What's in the ledger qualifies as documented evidence. She absorbed this. It wasn't resolution. Not yet. But it was the first time the door to resolution had been something other than completely closed. He deserved better, she said. My father. He deserved someone who would have told him there was another way. He had you, Ethan said. He just ran out of time to know it. She looked at him. He said it plain the way he said everything true, not as comfort, just as fact. And somehow that made it more comforting than anything softened would have been. The north fence, she said. Tomorrow morning, he said, if your shoulder's up to it. My shoulder is fine. He raised an eyebrow very slightly. My shoulder is adequately functional, she corrected. The thing that almost happened to his mouth happened again closer to completing itself this time. All right, he said. They finished the north fence the following morning. It took 4 hours working steadily, talking sometimes and not talking other times, moving in the rhythm they'd developed over weeks of shared work that had no wasted motion in it. She'd gotten better. She knew she'd gotten better, not because he told her he wasn't given to telling her things she could figure out herself, but because the work felt different in her hands. Surer, like her body had stopped questioning and started knowing. When they drove the last post, she stood back and looked at the completed line and felt something that was simpler than satisfaction, but contained it. Good, she said. Good? He agreed. She turned around to get the tools and found Cale Haskell at the property gate, waiting with the particular patience of a boy who'd learned that interrupting working people was bad manners. Message from Weir's office, Cale said. He held out a sealed letter. She took it, broke the seal, read it. Ethan was watching her face. Graves has been served, she said. Federal summons, issued yesterday from the circuit court in Denver. She kept reading. Sheriff Cordell's testimony included 3 additional instances of fraudulent documentation that were already on file in the county records. He's been sitting on them. She looked up. He was covering for Graves. Was, Ethan said. Past tense, she confirmed. He's agreed to full cooperation in exchange for consideration on his own exposure. She looked back at the letter. Weir says the case is solid. He says, she stopped. What? She read the section again to make sure she'd read it right. He says Callum's statement includes testimony about 6 additional properties in adjacent counties. Properties where the owners... She stopped again. Her throat tightened. 3 of them are deceased, in circumstances similar to my father's. The yard was very quiet. Cale looked between them and had the wisdom to say nothing. He didn't just do it to my family, she said. No, Ethan said. His voice was very quiet. She folded the letter. She folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket, and she stood in the yard with the finished fence behind her and the summer morning around her, and she breathed until the tightening in her throat had settled into something she could carry without it carrying her. 4 families, she said. At least. Weir will find all of them, Ethan said. That's what he does. I know. She looked at the gate where Cale was still waiting. She looked at the letter. She looked at the mountain above the property, clear and sharp in the morning air. Good, she said quietly to herself as much as anyone. Good. Let him find every one. She turned to Cale. Tell your father, and tell him thank you for everything he's done in this. Cale nodded, serious and straight-backed, in the way of a boy who'd wanted to be useful and had been. He swung his horse and headed back down the ridge road. She and Ethan stood in the yard. The families on the lower ridge, she said. The children who need a teacher. There are 4 of them, he said, between the ages of 7 and 12. Their parents have been trying to arrange something for 2 years. Can we reach them this week? He looked at her. You're sure you want to start now? The case is still... The case will take months, she said. Those children are falling behind right now. She looked at him. I'm sure. He nodded. I'll send word tomorrow. She picked up the tools and started back toward the shed. Moment, she heard him fall in behind her. The first lesson happened on a Thursday. She held it in the front room of a family named Greer, who lived a mile down the Lower Ridge Road in a house that was clean and practical, and had 4 children who regarded her with the specific wariness of young people who'd been let down before by adults who'd promised things. She'd brought chalk and a piece of smooth pine board she'd sanded and painted black over 2 evenings. She'd brought the 3 books from the cabin that were useful for teaching. She'd brought the same energy she'd always brought into a classroom, which was simply the deep and genuine conviction that what was in these children's heads mattered, and it was her job to help them use it better. The youngest, a girl of 7 named Iris, who had clearly been underestimated by most people she'd encountered, looked at the chalkboard and said, "That's not a real blackboard." "No," Claire said. "It's better. I made it." Iris considered this. "You made it yourself." "With help," she said. Iris looked at the board. "Can I write on it?" "That's exactly what it's for," she said. By the end of the first hour, she had all 4 of them working. By the end of the second hour, she had the eldest, a boy of 12 named Henry, reading aloud to the others from a passage she'd selected because it was genuinely interesting and not because it was easy. He stumbled on 2 words. She showed him how to break them. He went back and read them correctly. The look on his face when he got them right was the look she'd been teaching for, the one she'd missed, the one that said something had opened that hadn't been opened before. She rode back to the property in the late afternoon with the chalk dust still on her hands and something restored in her that she hadn't realized had been missing until it came back. Ethan was at the corral when she came through the gate. He looked at her. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Whatever was in her face told him what he needed to know. "Good day," he said. "Very good day," she said. He went back to the horse he'd been working with. She went inside to start supper. And that was the whole of it, and it was sufficient, and it was real. 6 weeks after they had filed in Denver, the circuit court convened. Weir sent word 3 days before. Ethan and Claire rode down from the mountain on a Tuesday morning with the documentation they'd been asked to provide, and testimony prepared in the careful, organized way that she prepared everything clear, specific, irrefutable. The courthouse in Denver was full. She hadn't expected that. She'd thought of it as a legal proceeding, which it was, but legal proceedings in territorial courts in 1878 were also public events, and word of what Graves had done had spread in the weeks since the summons was served with the speed that injustice once named tends to travel. Tom Haskell was there. Denny Frost. 4 other landholders she'd read about in the county records and was meeting for the first time. Samuel Weir at the front table, organized and calm. Sheriff Cordell in the gallery, reduced to civilian witness, wearing the expression of a man who understood that cooperation was his best available option. Harlan Graves sat at the defendant's table in a suit that was designed to communicate respectability. He looked at her when she came in. She looked back. She didn't drop her eyes. She sat beside Ethan in the gallery and waited for it to start. When she was called to testify, she walked to the stand and answered every question in the plain, clear, organized way she'd answered her students' questions for 6 years, not performing certainty, not managing impressions, just saying true things in the order they needed to be said. She held the ledger where the court could see it when Weir introduced it. She read her father's words in a voice that was steady because she'd decided beforehand it would be steady, and she honored her decisions. She looked at Graves once while she was speaking. Once was enough. He knew she wasn't afraid of him. He'd probably known it since Denver, since the boardwalk, since Callum had come back without a deal. He sat behind his table, with his gold watch chain catching the light and the particular stillness of a man who's watching something he built come apart and has run out of ways to stop it. When Callum took the stand, the room went very quiet. He was not the man she'd seen on the mountain property. Not in posture or in presence. He sat with the specific quality of someone who'd made a decision they couldn't unmake and had decided to be clean about it. He answered questions. He didn't minimize. He named names, dates, amounts. He described the 3 deaths in adjacent counties in terms specific enough to be documented and damning enough to silence the gallery twice. When he was done, he stepped down from the stand and he looked once briefly at Ethan. Ethan held his gaze for a moment. He didn't nod. He didn't look away. He simply acknowledged the look and let Callum pass. It wasn't forgiveness. Both of them knew that. Some things don't resolve into forgiveness, they resolve into the acknowledgement that they happened, and that what happens next belongs to the living. Harlan Graves was found liable on 14 counts. The federal circuit judge, a dry, precise man named Aldrich, who had been on the bench for 20 years, and had the expression of someone who'd heard most things and wasn't impressed by them, read the findings in a voice that was neither theatrical nor hurried. He addressed each count. He addressed the pattern. He addressed Thomas Dawson's death in terms that stopped short of homicide verdict. There wasn't enough for that. Not quite, not in the direct way she'd wanted, but he named it as a probable consequence of documented extortion and said so in the official record. It would stand. Permanently. Thomas Dawson's name in a federal record that said a man had driven him to his death by fraud and intimidation, and that this had been found and named, and would not be expunged. She heard it, and she sat very still, and she felt her father somewhere in that stillness, in the way you feel people who are gone in moments that would have mattered to them. She felt Ethan's hand close over hers on the bench between them. He didn't say anything. He didn't make it larger than it was. He just held her hand while the judge finished reading and the gallery began to murmur, and the world reorganized itself around the fact that Harlan Graves was a convicted man. She held on. She let herself hold on. So, they didn't stay in Denver afterward. Weir shook their hands. He told her she'd been the clearest witness he'd had in 30 years of practice, and he said it the way he said everything without embellishment, which meant she believed him. Tom Haskell embraced her with the forthright warmth of a man who'd decided she was family and had moved on from considering whether that was appropriate. Denny Frost said thank you twice and then looked embarrassed about it, and she told him it was she who should thank him for coming forward, and that settled things. They were on the horses and heading north within 2 hours. She didn't need to stay for the aftermath. The aftermath would happen without her. It would be documented and processed, and would work its way through the legal architecture of the territory over the next months, and she would be there for it when she needed to be. But right now, she needed the mountain and the air that was different up there, and the specific quality of the work that waited for her children on the lower ridge. A fence that was always needing some section of it, seen to horses that were curious and alive, and had no interest in territorial legal proceedings. She needed to go home. The word settled in her chest as she rode, and she let it. Home. The thing she'd driven toward her whole life without a clear picture of what it would look like, who would be in it, what she'd have to go through to earn it. She had a picture now. It looked like a cabin with a covered porch and a meadow dropping away to a creek she could hear at night from the upstairs window. It looked like coffee strong enough to disagree with you in the morning. It looked like a man who said is when you said was, and meant it as correction, not comfort, because he saw you clearly and wasn't going to let you diminish yourself in front of him. It looked like something she hadn't expected and had gotten anyway. A month after the verdict, Margaret and Nora came up the mountain for the first time. Margaret stood on the porch with both hands on the railing and looked out at the meadow and the ridgeline above it and didn't say anything for a long time. Nora went straight to the barn because she'd heard about the horses and had decided in advance to like them. "It's beautiful," Margaret said finally. "I know," Claire said. Her mother looked at her. At her hands, which were rough now in ways they hadn't been before. At her posture, which had changed, still straight, but different. The posture of someone who'd been tested in ways that had settled something rather than broken it. "You look well," Margaret said. "I am well," Claire said. Her mother looked toward the corral, where Ethan was showing Nora how to read a horse's disposition from the set of its ears. Nora was listening with the focused intensity she brought to things she'd decided were worth learning, which when she made that decision was formidable. "He keeps looking over here," Margaret said quietly. Claire looked. Ethan was explaining something to Nora. His back half turned to them, but her mother was right. He'd checked the porch twice in the past 5 minutes with the particular calibration of a man who wanted to be sure all right without making a production of wanting to be sure. "He does that," Claire said. "I know," her mother said. "That's what I'm saying." Claire watched him turn back to her sister patient and direct the same way he was with everything he bothered to teach. She thought about the 5 weeks it had taken her to stop expecting the other shoe to drop. She thought about the moment on the creek bank when he'd said, "I need to tell you something before we go back," before it settled, when there was no tactical reason to. She thought about his hand on the bench in the Denver courthouse, closing over hers without announcement or ceremony just there. "He's a good man," Claire said. Same words she'd said to Nora. They still fit exactly. "I know he is," Margaret said. She reached over and put her hand over her daughter's on the porch railing. "I'm glad you're not alone up here." "I'm not alone," Claire said. Her mother squeezed her hand and let go and turned back to the view. Below them, Nora laughed at something Ethan had said, or hadn't said. It was sometimes hard to tell, and the sound of it came up clear and bright in the mountain air. That evening after supper, all 4 of them around the table, something happened that Claire would think about later as the moment the shape of things became finally fully clear. Her mother asked about the schooling, about the children on the lower ridge, about the pine board she'd painted black and sanded smooth, and how the youngest one, Iris, had been the first to trust it. Claire answered, and as she answered, she heard the specificity of it. The investment, the genuine enthusiasm of someone talking about work that mattered to them, and she understood that this was the version of herself she'd been moving toward all along, not the version that survived, the version that built. Nora had questions about the horses. Ethan answered them with the patience he gave everything, and Nora, who was not easily impressed, was impressed. Toward the end of the evening, Margaret said, "Your father would have liked this," quietly, mostly to herself. Nobody rushed to respond. The words settled, and were allowed to settle. "He would have liked you," Claire said to Ethan. He looked at her. He thought about it genuinely, which was the only way he did anything. "Tell me about him," he said. "The real version." She looked at this man across her mother's coffee cups in a cabin on a mountain that had been a stranger's and was now a home, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not a declaration, not a rescue, not a promise made in the easy warmth before difficulty arrives. This 2 people who'd been through the fire together, sitting at a table asking to know each other better in the ordinary lamplit quiet of a life they'd chosen and kept choosing. She told him about her father, the real version, all of it. He listened the whole way through. The following spring, a circuit judge came through Millhaven on his quarterly rounds. He stopped at the property on the mountain, a courtesy call, he said, though Weir had probably suggested it, and he sat at the same kitchen table with Ethan and Claire and a pot of strong coffee and talked through the remaining elements of the Graves case, which was working its way through the upper courts with the inevitable slowness of large machinery that has been properly set in motion. 2 of the 3 deaths in adjacent counties had been reclassified in the official record. Families had been notified. It wasn't the resolution any of those families had wanted. Nobody wanted the record. They wanted the person back. But the record stood and meant something and could not be taken back. The judge looked around the kitchen before he left. At the evidence of 2 people living a life, the tools by the door, the books on the shelf, the chalk dust on the table from where she'd been preparing the next week's lesson. "You've built something here," he said. Simply, not as flattery. "We have," Ethan said. The judge looked at Claire. "You testified well," he said. "In Denver, I read the transcript. I told the truth," she said. "That's all." "That's the hardest part," the judge said. "In my experience." He shook their hands and rode back down the mountain. That evening, she stood on the back porch and looked at the summer light moving over the meadow and thought about the morning she'd stood in a bank with a shaking hand and signed a paper that was supposed to be the end of her choices. She thought about what it had actually been, the beginning of the ones that mattered. Behind her, she heard him come through the back door. He stood beside her on the porch the way he stood beside her when he was simply there and not trying to be anything else. And they both looked at the meadow and the light and the mountain above them, clear and enormous and indifferent in the beautiful way of things that have been here long before you and will be here long after. Henry read 2 full chapters yesterday, she said, without stopping. The boy who couldn't get through a paragraph in September. The same one. She heard him make the sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but had learned to happen more often over the months. You did that, he said. He did that, she said. I just showed him it was possible. He was quiet for a moment. That's teaching. Yes, she said. That's exactly what it is. She felt his hand find hers at the porch railing, the same way it had in the Denver courthouse. No announcement, no ceremony, just there. Certain. Warm. The hand of a man who decided and didn't need to keep deciding, because some things, once you know them, stay known. She turned her hand over and held on. The mountain held them both. The summer light held the mountain. The creak she'd been hearing from the upstairs window since her first night ran on below the meadow, the same as it always had, carrying nothing and everything the way water does. She was a schoolteacher on a mountain in the summer of her 24th year, standing beside a man who had never once asked her to be less than she was, holding the life she'd built with her own hands out of the wreckage of a morning when she'd thought her choices were finished. They were not finished. They had, in fact, just begun, and every day she chose this: the work, the mountain, the man beside her, the children on the lower ridge, the fence that always needed some section of it, seen to it became more fully hers. Not given, not arranged, not traded for debt or desperation, chosen, freely, with the full knowledge of what it cost and what it was worth. That was the difference. That had always been the difference. And on that mountain in that summer, with that man's hand in hers, Claire Dawson finally knew it all the way down.